Beneath the sprawling, moss-draped limbs of ancient oak trees in St. Michael's Cemetery, a quiet corner of Charleston, South Carolina holds a dark secret. Here lie 9 graves, weathered by time and humidity, that the city's most powerful families have refused to speak of for generations. Each headstone, carved from stone that now crumbles at the edges, bears the name of a wealthy plantation owner who perished between 1851 and 1855, all under eerily similar circumstances. A sudden, creeping paralysis, followed by what the physicians of that era called a merciful death. But mercy was a stranger to these men's final hours. In 1923, during a much-needed cemetery renovation, groundskeepers unearthed a truth so horrifying that city officials immediately ordered it sealed from public record. Inside each of those 9 coffins, the wooden lids were scarred with deep, frantic scratch marks from human fingernails. The bodies themselves were found contorted into positions of desperate, silent struggle. What the authorities discovered next would cast a shadow over Charleston's elite that lingers to this day. A leather-bound journal, protected from the damp soil by oilcloth, buried beneath the gnarled roots of the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree. It was written in the precise, careful handwriting of a man named Solomon Fairfax, and it detailed 4 years of calculated, cold-blooded revenge, a story that began with a family's screams and ended with 9 powerful men buried alive. Before we delve deeper into the story of Solomon Fairfax, and the dark secret that transformed a gentle healer into Charleston's most methodical avenger, we need you to join our community of truth seekers. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss these buried stories from America's past. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our audience across the country. The journal's first entry, dated March 15, 1851, began with a single line that pulsed with a grief so profound it would fuel an inferno of vengeance. "Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it." Charleston in the 1850s was the crown jewel of Southern aristocracy, a city of breathtaking beauty built on breathtaking cruelty. White-columned mansions, their verandas catching the sweet scent of jasmine and the salty tang of the Cooper River, housed dynasties whose fortunes were built on rice, cotton, and the shattered lives of human beings. The city's medical community, though small, commanded immense respect among this wealthy elite, who could afford private physicians for their increasingly common ailments, mysterious fevers, sudden weakness, and strange paralytic conditions that seemed to plague Charleston's most prominent families with an alarming regularity. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway had established his practice on Meeting Street in 1845, swiftly earning a reputation among Charleston's upper class for his innovative treatments and an unusual understanding of exotic remedies. But his success was not entirely his own. It stemmed in large part from his exceptional assistant, a slave named Solomon Fairfax, who possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of medicinal plants and chemical compounds. Solomon had been purchased specifically for Dr. Hathaway's practice after demonstrating remarkable skills in botanical medicine, skills passed down through generations of his family, healers who had served on plantations throughout the Carolina Lowcountry. Solomon Fairfax was not a typical field hand. He stood tall, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings, every subtle shift in a patient's breathing, every trembling hand. He had been educated alongside the children of his previous master, learning to read and write long before such an education was strictly forbidden, a dangerous secret he guarded closely. His knowledge of Latin medical terms impressed even Dr. Hathaway, who grew to rely on Solomon's steady hand to prepare complex compounds and assist with the most delicate procedures. The wealthy patients who frequented Hathaway's practice, men and women accustomed to being served, grew comfortable with Solomon's quiet presence. They began requesting him specifically for his gentle bedside manner and his seemingly intuitive grasp of their suffering. But Solomon's life had not always been confined to the sterile, carbolic-scented walls of a medical practice. For 32 years before being sold to Dr. Hathaway, he had lived on the Pemberton Plantation, 15 miles outside Charleston. There, he had known a life of quiet dignity. He had married a woman named Celia and raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, in a small cabin that was, for them, a home. The Pembertons had allowed this arrangement because Solomon's healing skills were invaluable, a shield against the frequent outbreaks of fever and disease that could devastate a plantation's workforce overnight. Solomon's expertise saved countless lives, both enslaved and free, earning him a measure of respect that was a rare and fragile thing for a man in his position. He developed treatments for everything from venomous snake bites to the racking cough of consumption, using a combination of traditional African remedies passed down from his grandmother and new techniques he learned by carefully observing the white physicians who occasionally visited the plantation. The Pembertons had even allowed him to tend to their own family during times of illness, a privilege that demonstrated the genuine trust they placed in his abilities. This relative comfort, this illusion of stability, was shattered in March of 1851. Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts, a secret cancer eating away at his fortune, forced him to sell portions of his human property to cover his mounting financial obligations. The sale was to include Solomon's wife and children. They would be separated, scattered to different plantations across the state, a common practice that plantation owners justified as a business necessity, but which destroyed families as completely as any hurricane. Solomon pleaded with Edmund Pemberton, his voice steady but his heart breaking. He offered to work additional years without any compensation, anything to keep his family together. He even suggested alternative arrangements, proposing to hire himself out to other plantations during peak seasons to generate extra income. But Pemberton, facing creditors who demanded immediate payment, was deaf to his pleas. The sale was scheduled for March 14, 1851, at the Charleston slave market. Nothing would change that decision. The morning of March 14 dawned gray and suffocatingly humid. Storm clouds gathered over the Ashley River, as if nature itself sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Solomon had spent the previous night holding his family close in their small cabin, committing to memory every detail of their faces, every sound of their breathing, knowing that sunrise would bring a separation more final than death. Celia, his wife of 15 years, had maintained a stoic composure, focusing her energy on preparing their children for the horror that lay ahead. 8-year-old Marcus, the eldest, had inherited Solomon's quiet intelligence and boundless curiosity about the world beyond the plantation. 6-year-old Samuel possessed his father's gentle nature and a natural affinity for healing, often helping Solomon gather medicinal plants from the woods surrounding their quarters. Their daughter, 4-year-old Grace, clung to her mother, her small body trembling with the instinctive understanding that something terrible was about to happen, though she could not possibly comprehend the full scope of what awaited them. As the slave traders arrived, their voices loud and their movements rough, Solomon watched helplessly as his family was loaded into a wagon, alongside 6 other families being torn apart by Edmund Pemberton's financial desperation. The children's tears mixed with their parents' frantic, whispered promises that they would find each other again, somehow, someday, promises everyone knew were lies, fragile shields against an unbearable pain. But the true horror began on the journey to Charleston. Halfway to the city, one of the wagon wheels struck a deep rut in the rain-soaked road, causing the vehicle to lurch violently. In the ensuing chaos, Celia fell from the wagon, her head striking a sharp rock embedded in the roadside. Blood began to flow immediately from the wound. Solomon, despite his shackled hands, fought and strained, trying desperately to reach her. The slave traders, concerned only with delivering their cargo in sellable condition, made a decision that would sear itself into Solomon's soul. Rather than seeking medical attention, they declared Celia a loss and ordered the wagon to continue without her. Solomon screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, and fought against his restraints as they left his wife bleeding and unconscious by the roadside. The other slaves held him back, their eyes filled with a shared terror, knowing that resistance would only bring a whip down on everyone. The nightmare intensified at the Charleston slave market, a place where humanity was stripped away and souls were priced. Solomon was forced to watch as his children were sold to separate buyers. Marcus was purchased by a rice planter from Georgetown who specialized in using child labor for the dangerous work of tending irrigation systems in alligator-infested swamps. Samuel was bought by a cotton farmer from the upcountry whose reputation for working slaves to death was a whispered warning throughout the region. Grace, too young for fieldwork, was sold to a family in Savannah as a house servant, disappearing forever into the vast, brutal network of human bondage that connected southern cities. Through it all, Solomon maintained an outward mask of resignation, knowing any display of emotion would only worsen his own fate. Inside, however, something fundamental had broken. The man who had dedicated his life to healing, to preserving life and easing suffering, watched as everything he loved was destroyed by the casual cruelty of men who viewed human beings as property to be liquidated when convenient. Dr. Hathaway, unaware of the full scope of Solomon's tragedy, purchased him primarily for his medical skills, paying a premium price that reflected Solomon's reputation. The doctor had heard of Solomon's abilities from other physicians and desperately needed someone with his advanced knowledge to help with his growing practice. As Solomon was led away from the slave market to begin his new life, he cast one final look back at the place where his family had been scattered to the winds. In that moment, something cold and calculating settled into his heart. A patience as deep and unmoving as the bedrock beneath the city. A patience that would allow him to wait, to learn, and, eventually, to make those responsible pay a price that matched the enormity of their crimes. That evening, alone in the small room above Dr. Hathaway's practice that would serve as his new quarters, Solomon began writing in a leather journal he had managed to keep hidden. His first entry, written by the flickering light of a single candle, began with words that would define the next 4 years of his life. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I am still alive. And I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they have broken me, but they have only taught me patience. The months following Solomon's arrival at Dr. Hathaway's practice passed in a blur of routine medical procedures and silent, methodical observation. Solomon performed his duties with the same quiet competence he had always shown, mixing compounds, preparing treatment rooms, and assisting with patient care. But beneath this placid facade, he was conducting an entirely different kind of study, learning the intimate details of Charleston's medical community and the wealthy families who comprised Dr. Hathaway's clientele. Dr. Hathaway, a widower in his 50s with no children, had come to rely heavily on Solomon's expertise. The doctor suffered from an arthritis that made precise work increasingly difficult, and Solomon's steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal preparations had become indispensable. More importantly for Solomon's developing plans, Dr. Hathaway had begun allowing him to handle certain patient interactions independently, particularly when dealing with chronic conditions that required regular monitoring. Charleston's wealthy elite, accustomed to the finest medical care, initially viewed Solomon with the typical mixture of casual indifference and condescending approval they reserved for skilled slaves. However, his obvious competence and respectful demeanor gradually earned him a level of trust that would prove crucial. Patients began requesting him specifically, praising his gentle touch and his uncanny understanding of their conditions. During this period, Solomon methodically researched the backgrounds of every wealthy family that visited the practice. He learned about their business dealings, their social connections, and most importantly, their involvement in the slave trade that had annihilated his family. Through careful listening and discreet inquiries among the network of slaves who worked in Charleston's grand houses, he compiled detailed information about the men who had participated in or profited from the auction that had scattered his children across the South. His investigation revealed that Edmund Pemberton had been merely one link in a much larger chain of exploitation. The Charleston slave market operated with the enthusiastic support of the city's most respected citizens, men who served on church boards and charitable committees while simultaneously treating human beings as livestock. These were the men who attended elegant dinner parties to discuss literature and philosophy while their wealth was built on the suffering of families like Solomon's. Among Dr. Hathaway's regular patients, Solomon identified 9 men with direct connections to his family's destruction. Some had been present at the auction, bidding on human cargo with the same detached interest they might show when purchasing horses. Others had provided financial backing for the slave trading operation, lending money to dealers who specialized in breaking up families to maximize profits. A few had purchased slaves from the very same auction, contributing to the system that treated human beings as disposable commodities. As 1851 bled into 1852, Solomon began what he privately termed his education in advanced chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library contained numerous texts on pharmaceutical compounds, including detailed descriptions of substances that could produce paralysis, unconsciousness, or the appearance of death, all while leaving the victim's mind terrifyingly aware. These books, written for legitimate medical purposes, became Solomon's textbooks in a curriculum of revenge. His most significant discovery came in a treatise on South American plant toxins. It described a compound derived from a vine that grew in the Amazon basin but had been successfully cultivated in the greenhouse of a Charleston botanist who supplied exotic specimens to wealthy collectors. This particular toxin, when properly prepared, could induce a state of complete muscular paralysis while leaving the victim's consciousness and sensation of pain entirely intact. The affected person would appear dead to casual observation, but would remain fully, horribly aware of their surroundings for several hours before the toxin's effects proved fatal. Solomon spent months learning to identify and cultivate the plant, eventually locating specimens in the greenhouse of Dr. Hathaway's friend, Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, who taught natural sciences at the College of Charleston. The professor, blissfully unaware of Solomon's true interest, was delighted to find someone who shared his passion for exotic botany and began allowing Solomon to help maintain his greenhouse collection. Through careful, clandestine experimentation with laboratory mice, Solomon determined the precise dosage. Too little would cause only temporary weakness. Too much would result in immediate death. But the correct amount would create a state indistinguishable from death to anyone lacking extensive medical knowledge, preserving the victim's consciousness long enough to experience the ultimate terror of being buried alive. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more demanding than mastering the chemistry. Solomon had to maintain his gentle, helpful demeanor while internally preparing to watch men suffer in a way that violated the very core of his healing nature. He justified this chilling transformation by regularly reviewing the names of his children in his journal, reminding himself of their fate and the callous indifference of the men who had profited from their sale. As winter approached in 1852, Solomon had identified his first target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a wealthy rice planter who had not only attended the auction but had loudly joked about the breeding potential of the children being offered for sale. Fitzpatrick suffered from chronic gout and visited Dr. Hathaway's practice monthly for treatments that provided temporary relief. The Colonel's regular appointments, his absolute trust in Solomon's medical abilities, and his habit of arriving alone made him an ideal first victim. But Solomon forced himself to wait. Patience and perfect execution were essential to avoid suspicion and ensure that all 9 men received the justice they so richly deserved. In his journal, Solomon wrote detailed profiles of each intended victim, noting their medical conditions, their treatment schedules, and their role in the slave trade. These entries read like a physician's case notes, but they documented a very different kind of treatment plan, one designed not to heal, but to ensure that 9 men would experience the same helpless terror that his own children had felt as they were torn from everything they had ever known. The transformation of Solomon Fairfax from healer to methodical killer began with a meticulous preparation that spanned the entirety of 1852. Every detail had to be perfect, every variable controlled. The men he intended to target were pillars of Charleston society, and their deaths would be scrutinized by the city's most prominent physicians and investigated by authorities under intense pressure to find explanations. Solomon's first step was to establish himself as an indispensable part of Dr. Hathaway's practice. He began arriving earlier each morning and staying later each evening, demonstrating such dedication that Dr. Hathaway increasingly relied on his judgment. This growing trust was essential for the moments when Solomon needed to handle patients independently. The development of his paralytic compound required months of careful refinement. Working in a small shed behind Dr. Hathaway's office, ostensibly to prepare herbal remedies, Solomon cultivated the toxic vine. The process was perilous. Several times he accidentally exposed himself to small amounts of the toxin, experiencing a temporary numbness that gave him a terrifying preview of what his victims would endure. The final compound was a colorless, odorless liquid that could be easily mixed with other medications without detection. When administered correctly, it would take effect within 30 minutes, initially causing a weakness that would be attributed to the patient's existing condition. Within an hour, complete paralysis would set in, but the victim would remain conscious, able to hear, see, and feel everything. Crucially, the paralysis was so profound it would be impossible to detect breathing or a pulse without extremely careful examination. To the physicians of the 1850s, a patient treated with Solomon's compound would appear to have died peacefully. Solomon's selection of Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick as his first victim was both strategic and deeply personal. Fitzpatrick's monthly visits for gout provided a predictable schedule, and his arrogant demeanor made him particularly easy to despise. More importantly, Fitzpatrick lived alone, save for house slaves who were terrified of him, making it unlikely anyone would insist on a detailed examination of his body. The colonel's medical history provided the perfect cover. He suffered from a weak heart, a condition Dr. Hathaway had monitored for years. A sudden death would naturally be attributed to heart failure. On December 15, 1852, Colonel Fitzpatrick arrived for his appointment, complaining of worsening pain. Dr. Hathaway was attending another patient, so he instructed Solomon to prepare Fitzpatrick's usual treatment and begin the consultation. This routine delegation provided the perfect opportunity. As Solomon prepared the medication, he added precisely measured drops of his compound to the solution. Years of medical practice had taught him to maintain steady hands and a calm expression. These skills served him well as he crossed the line from healer to killer. Fitzpatrick, accustomed to receiving treatments from Solomon, consumed the medication without hesitation. The conversation that followed would be burned into Solomon's memory forever. As the toxin began to take hold and Fitzpatrick felt a wave of weakness wash over him, Solomon sat beside the colonel's chair and spoke in the same gentle tone he had always used. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," he said quietly, "my name is Solomon Fairfax. You destroyed my family at the slave auction on March 14, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. You joked about their value as breeding stock. Do you remember?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, already glazing over, showed a flicker of recognition, then dawning horror. He tried to speak, to call for help, but found his voice had been stolen along with his ability to move. Solomon continued, his tone chillingly professional. "You are not dying yet, Colonel. The medicine I gave you has paralyzed every muscle in your body, but your mind is completely clear. You can hear every word I am saying. In about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will examine you and pronounce you dead from heart failure. Your body will be prepared for burial, and tomorrow evening you will be placed in your coffin." Solomon leaned closer, his face a mask of cold resolve. "But you won't actually die until several hours after you are buried. You will be completely aware as the dirt is shoveled onto your coffin. You will hear every sound, feel every sensation, and have plenty of time to think about what you did to my children. That is when you will understand what terror really feels like." The paralysis was now absolute. Fitzpatrick appeared to be a corpse, but Solomon could see the frantic, desperate awareness in his eyes. Solomon checked the colonel's pulse and breathing, confirming both were so faint as to be undetectable. When Dr. Hathaway entered 5 minutes later, he found Solomon standing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's body. "I'm afraid the colonel has passed, Doctor," Solomon reported quietly. His heart gave out. He seemed to go very peacefully. Dr. Hathaway's examination confirmed the diagnosis. The cause of death seemed obvious. Solomon attended the funeral, standing respectfully in the section designated for slaves as the coffin was lowered into the ground. As the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the wooden lid with a dull thud, Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick was still conscious, still listening. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a cold, grim sense of justice finally being served. That evening, Solomon made the second entry in his journal. "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain." The months following Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial passed with agonizing slowness as Solomon waited to see if his method had aroused any suspicion. Charleston's social circles buzzed with condolences, but no one questioned the circumstances of his death. Dr. Hathaway even mentioned the case to other physicians as an example of how quickly heart failure could claim a man. Solomon's reputation as a skilled and caring assistant remained untarnished. This success gave him the confidence to proceed, but it also forced him to confront the psychological toll of his actions. Despite his certainty, watching a man die in terror had affected him more deeply than he expected. He found himself unable to sleep, haunted not by guilt, but by the vivid imagination of what Fitzpatrick had experienced in those final hours buried alive. His second victim required careful consideration. He needed to avoid establishing any pattern. His research identified Judge Marcus Calverton as the ideal target, a man who had not only witnessed the sale of Solomon's family but had provided legal justification for separating slave families, arguing in court that it was essential for economic efficiency. Judge Calverton suffered from severe migraines and sought treatment from Dr. Hathaway frequently. The judge's condition provided both opportunity and cover. Migraine sufferers were known to occasionally suffer fatal strokes, a medically plausible outcome for a man of Calverton's age. But before Solomon could act, an unexpected complication arose. In March of 1853, Dr. Hathaway announced he was considering taking on a junior partner, a young physician named Dr. Timothy Henderson from Philadelphia. Dr. Henderson's presence would mean increased scrutiny, more witnesses, and greater difficulty administering his compound without detection. Worse, Henderson had trained under physicians familiar with the latest advances in forensic medicine. Solomon realized he would have to accelerate his timeline. Rather than spacing the deaths over years, he would need to complete his mission within months. The pressure to move quickly led to his first serious mistake. While preparing Judge Calverton's treatment in April 1853, Solomon accidentally used a slightly higher dose of his compound. The judge's apparent death occurred more rapidly, and the paralysis was so intense that even Dr. Hathaway noticed something unusual. "Strange," the doctor murmured as he examined the corpse. "The muscle rigidity seems more pronounced than typical. And look at his eyes. There's something almost desperate about their expression." Solomon's heart pounded as Hathaway conducted a more thorough examination than he had with Fitzpatrick. For several terrifying minutes, Solomon feared his plan was about to unravel. But the doctor's training, while advanced for its time, lacked the specific knowledge to recognize the effects of the exotic toxin. He concluded the symptoms were simply the result of a particularly severe stroke. "Poor man must have suffered terribly in his final moments," Dr. Hathaway observed, unknowingly describing exactly what Judge Calverton was experiencing at that very moment, paralyzed but conscious as his body was prepared for burial. Judge Calverton's funeral was attended by even more prominent citizens than the colonel's. Solomon watched from the slave section as the coffin was lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery, just 3 rows from where Fitzpatrick lay. As the funeral concluded, Solomon noticed something that sent a chill through his blood. A young man standing near the back of the crowd was taking careful notes in a small leather book. The man was Thomas Grimby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury, who had begun investigating what he privately called the prominent deaths phenomenon, a statistically unlikely series of sudden fatalities among the city's elite. Grimby had noticed a pattern. Solomon's journal entry that evening reflected his growing dread. "Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing true justice. But I fear others are beginning to notice patterns. I must work faster." The acceleration meant his third victim, Captain William Dandridge, would have to be eliminated within weeks. Dandridge, a ship owner who transported slaves throughout the South, had personally supervised the loading of human cargo with the same care he showed for cotton bales. He presented a unique challenge. He was generally healthy and only sought medical care for minor injuries. Solomon would need to create an opportunity. The solution came through his network among Charleston's enslaved community. He learned that Captain Dandridge was planning a dinner party for prominent members of the shipping community on May 20, 1853. Kitchen staff for such events were often borrowed from other households. Solomon, through careful planning, arranged to assist with serving the dinner, giving him direct access to Dandridge and his guests. But even as he refined his plans, Thomas Grimby was conducting his own investigation, visiting St. Michael's Cemetery, noting the locations of recent burials, and documenting the medical histories of the deceased. What he was discovering would soon threaten everything Solomon had worked to accomplish. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The evening of May 20, 1853 marked the beginning of the end for Solomon Fairfax's methodical campaign. The dinner party at Captain Dandridge's mansion brought together 12 of Charleston's most influential shipping merchants, an unprecedented opportunity for Solomon to study multiple targets at once. He had arranged his participation through Martha, an elderly slave who supervised kitchen operations for many of Charleston's grandest social events. The captain's dining room gleamed with crystal and silver as Charleston's maritime elite gathered to discuss the expansion of shipping routes and the increasing profitability of human cargo. Solomon moved through the room with practiced invisibility, refilling wine glasses while listening to conversations that revealed the casual brutality underlying their prosperity. Captain Dandridge, a robust man with weathered hands, held court at the head of the table, regaling his guests with stories of profitable voyages and strategies for maximizing the value of slave shipments. Solomon's opportunity came during dessert. Working in the kitchen, he carefully added his paralytic compound to the captain's portion of brandy-soaked cake. The toxin was absorbed into the alcohol, masking any potential taste. Captain Dandridge consumed his dessert with obvious enjoyment. Within 30 minutes, he began experiencing a slight dizziness, which he attributed to the evening's wine. As the paralysis progressed, he excused himself from the table, claiming he needed fresh air. Solomon watched from the kitchen doorway as the captain made his way to his private study, where he collapsed into a leather chair just as the toxin reached full effect. The discovery of his death 20 minutes later created exactly the kind of chaos Solomon had hoped to avoid. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the dinner guests, examined the body. "This is most peculiar," he announced. "Captain Dandridge appears to have suffered some form of seizure, but there are no obvious symptoms of apoplexy or heart failure. The muscle rigidity is quite pronounced, almost as if he had been poisoned." The word "poisoned" sent a shock through the room. By morning, news of the suspicious death had spread throughout Charleston. Thomas Grimby arrived at the mansion before dawn, interviewing servants and guests. His investigation revealed that Solomon had been present, the first time any individual could be connected to multiple recent deaths. The net was closing, but his mission remained incomplete. 6 of his targets were still alive. Desperation led Solomon to make the most dangerous decision of his campaign. He would attempt to kill multiple targets simultaneously. His research had identified a private meeting scheduled for June 15, 1853, when 6 of Charleston's most prominent slave traders would gather at the offices of Henderson and Associates. The evening meeting provided an opportunity to trap all 6 men in a confined space. His plan was both ingenious and terrifying. Over 2 weeks, working at night, he prepared a large quantity of his compound in a highly concentrated form. Instead of administering it individually, he would introduce it into the building's air supply through the gas lighting system. By injecting the toxin into the main gas line, he could ensure that everyone in the building would be exposed to lethal doses within minutes of the lamps being lit. On the night of June 15, Solomon positioned himself in the alley behind the Henderson and Associates building. At exactly 8 p.m., the office windows began to glow. His trap was sprung. Within 30 minutes, the building fell silent. He waited another hour before using a duplicate key to enter. The scene that greeted him was both horrifying and satisfying. 6 men sat frozen around a mahogany table. Their eyes, the only part of their bodies still capable of movement, tracked Solomon as he moved around the room, revealing the terror trapped within their immobilized forms. He approached each man, speaking in the same calm, professional tone he had used before. He identified himself and explained exactly what was happening, describing in clinical detail how they would remain conscious throughout their burial and the hours of suffocation that would follow. The panic in their eyes gave him a satisfaction that years of planning had not prepared him for. But his moment of triumph was short-lived. As he prepared to leave, he heard footsteps in the corridor. The door opened to reveal Thomas Grimby. "So, it's true," Grimby said quietly, his voice a mixture of horror and vindication. "Someone has been systematically murdering Charleston's elite. And you're the one responsible." Solomon realized his plans had finally unraveled. There was no way to explain his presence. "They destroyed my family," Solomon said simply, making no attempt to deny his actions. "They sold my children like cattle and left my wife to die by the roadside. This is justice, not murder." Grimby's response revealed the complexity of his position. As a journalist, he was committed to exposing the truth. As a Southerner, he understood the brutal realities that had motivated Solomon. "Those men in there," Grimby said, gesturing toward the paralyzed victims. They're still alive, aren't they? That's why their eyes are moving. Solomon nodded. They'll experience exactly what my children felt. They'll have hours to think about what they did. The standoff was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices. Both men realized that within minutes, the scene would be discovered. There's a back stairs, Grimby said quietly. You could still escape. I could delay reporting this, give you time. But Solomon had already accepted his fate. His mission was incomplete, but he would not run. I'm not running, he said with calm certainty. Let them come. Let them discover what I've done. Maybe when this story spreads, other people will understand that even slaves have limits to what they'll endure in silence. The voices grew louder. Grimby made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose to protect his story. When Charleston city constables burst into the room, they found a scene that defied explanation. 6 prominent citizens, apparently dead but with eyes wide with terror, and a slave standing calmly beside them, offering a complete confession. Solomon's confession provided authorities with the information that solved not only the evening's multiple deaths but also the mysterious fatalities that had puzzled the city for nearly 2 years. The trial of Solomon Fairfax became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in Charleston's history, not because of any doubt about his guilt, but because of the moral questions it raised. The prosecution presented it as a simple matter of murder. The defense, led by a reluctant attorney named Benjamin Crawford, faced the impossible task of defending a confessed killer by exposing the brutal realities of the slave system that had created him. Crawford's strategy was to put the institution of slavery itself on trial. Testimony about the casual cruelty of slave auctions and the complete legal powerlessness of enslaved people created an uncomfortable mirror for a society that preferred to view slavery as a benevolent institution. Thomas Grimby's coverage of the trial for the Charleston Mercury created a sensation. His articles, which included excerpts from Solomon's journal, were reprinted in newspapers across the South. The story of the slave who turned his medical knowledge into an instrument of revenge became a source of both fascination and terror. The 6 men who had been paralyzed provided the most dramatic testimony. All had survived, their experiences varying in horror depending on how long each had remained conscious. Their accounts of lying paralyzed while fully aware, hearing their own deaths pronounced, created a visceral understanding of Solomon's revenge. Colonel Harrison Vance, one of the survivors, described the psychological torture. I could hear everything, feel everything, but I could not move so much as an eyelid. When my wife wept over my body, I wanted desperately to comfort her, to let her know I was still alive. But I was trapped inside my own corpse. The revelation that 3 of Solomon's earlier victims, Colonel Fitzpatrick, Judge Calverton, and Captain Dandridge, had been buried while still alive created a public outcry. Solomon himself remained calm and articulate throughout, showing no remorse. His final statement to the court was a chilling summary of his motivations. I was trained to preserve life. But when this society destroyed my family while calling it legal and proper, I learned that the same knowledge used to heal can also be used to ensure justice. I do not ask for mercy because no mercy was shown to my wife and children. The jury's deliberation lasted less than an hour. Solomon Fairfax was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed on October 15, 1853, before a crowd of over 2,000 people. His final words, recorded by Thomas Grimby, were spoken with the same calm certainty he had shown throughout. I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits. Solomon's body was buried in an unmarked grave. His journal, however, was not lost. Thomas Grimby, who had been allowed to examine it, had made extensive copies. Years later, he buried the original journal beneath the magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, near the graves of the men Solomon had killed. The journalist's own account explained his decision. I could not bear to destroy the record of such methodical revenge, but I also could not allow it to inspire others. Perhaps future generations will be better equipped to understand the terrible necessity that drove Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer. The discovery of that journal in 1923, during the renovation that revealed the scratch marks inside 9 coffins, provided the final, horrifying confirmation. The physical evidence, the scratches made by fingernails desperately clawing at wooden coffin lids, proved that the legend was true. Charleston's city government immediately classified the discovery and sealed all records, officially to prevent racial tensions, but many believed the real motivation was to protect the reputations of prominent families whose ancestors had profited from the slave trade. The legacy of Solomon Fairfax's revenge was profound. Throughout the South, slave owners grew suspicious of educated slaves. New laws were passed restricting their access to books and medical training. The case also influenced the development of forensic medicine, prompting research into methods for detecting unusual toxins. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the national debate about slavery itself. The story challenged the fundamental assumption that the institution was stable. If a man like Solomon Fairfax, educated, skilled, and trusted, could plan and execute such methodical revenge, what did that say about the true feelings of the millions of other enslaved people throughout the South? This mystery shows us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, individual acts of resistance could shake the foundations of seemingly unshakable systems. The story of Solomon Fairfax reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, it simply takes a different, more terrible form. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Solomon's actions were justified? Or was his revenge simply another form of evil? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dark journey into America's hidden history, subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex truths that lie beneath our nation's official histories. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly buried. It's always waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to dig.